As mentioned before, in order to build a successful product, you need to start from as many ideas as you can. This is to ensure that your work is not biased by the very first idea that came to mind. A lot of us have an idea, but we don't know if that's concrete enough. Or we know that it is not, but don't know what to do with it. Sometimes we are on the other side of the spectrum. We have a very specific idea, but don't know how to generalize it and where to go from there. In this video, I'll talk about a process through which you can start from an idea, generalize it, and generate many similar ideas that address the same fundamental problem. Once you have all those ideas, you go through them by prioritizing them, and then go on to invalidate the bad ideas. Doing this exercise correctly will also lay the foundation for all your strategy and planning work that you will do later. Let's go back to the so what exercise we did previously for our farmer friends. What we essentially did there is building the so-called abstraction ladder. The idea here is that as we go up or down through this list, we are becoming more concrete or abstract about the idea that we are working on. We become more concrete when we move up by reading each statement and asking ourselves how. The answer should be the next item on the list. We become more abstract as we move down by reading each statement and asking ourselves why. This is exactly what we did previously in the so what exercise. For sake of demonstration, I asked myself how one more time on the original idea and added a more concrete one. Depending on how concrete your original idea is, you might or might not necessarily need to do this step. But sometimes you might have to do it multiple times if your idea is not very concrete. Now, the last statement on the very bottom of this list is the most fundamental why, and should form the fundamental reason that you're solving this problem. In principle, that's something that you don't want to change, because otherwise you risk the chances of jumping too much from branch to branch rather than refining your original idea into a good product within the constraints of the same mission. However, you need many versions of the most concrete idea that you have, because you want to select one of those ideas and eventually build. The point here is to explore the space of possibilities to ensure that you're not stuck in a local optimum based on your initial and most probably uneducated judgment of what the problem is. Rather, you want to have a good understanding of the idea space and think about how that can lead you to your mission and what is the right path to go from that idea to the mission. Now, how would you generate a lot of ideas? So we have one idea and we want to generate many ideas like that. The first step is to go through the so what exercise to generate various layers of abstraction of the idea that we had. This will help us get to the fundamental why. As mentioned, if your idea is not specific enough, try asking yourself how a few times and add a few layers that are more concrete than your original idea. Now, pick one of those layers that feels fairly abstract and call it very abstract idea number 1. Where you start depends on how many ideas you want to generate. The more abstract you go, the more concrete ideas you will generate at the end. But don't get too overambitious. Now ask yourself, how would I achieve this? The good news is you already have one answer. That's the next item from your so what exercise. Let's call that abstract idea number 1. Now ask yourself, how else would I achieve this? Now that's your abstract idea number 2. I'm just adding one more idea here, but you can add as many as you want depending on how ripe the idea is. One word of caution here is that make sure you're not just reframing the first idea and selling it as a new one, because that's cheating. What you're trying to do here is to map out an idea that is as mutually exclusive to your abstract idea number 1 as possible. Then ask yourself how again. Yes, you already have the answer and you know the drill. Come up with a new one and ask ask yourself how and how else again to come up with as many answers as you need for all the ideas that you had in the previous layer. You can repeat this process as many times as you need until you get to the most concrete layer that you need to go. In this simple example, I'm showing here that you go from the original idea to 8 concrete ideas. Let's see how this works for our farmer friends. I'm not going to go through all the details here, but please pause the video and check them out. A few things that I want to point out is notice how through this exercise we have uncovered so many dimensions and aspects that we hadn't originally thought about. This exercise gives us so much context about the problem that we're trying to solve. Knowing all of this context is so valuable in all the planning and execution steps that we will do later. This helps us remember why and in what context we picked the problem that we're working on, and why that was the best possible idea out of all possibilities. Again, to remind you, this was the original idea that we had, and within an hour or so I came up with all these possibilities. One thing that I had to do, and you will certainly have to do, is to check out each of these junctions. Whenever you're stuck, you have to go Google it, do some research, and find out what the meaningful branchings are. Lastly, what I want to point out is that this set of ideas that I generated here are not comprehensive and are probably very biased. A very good practice for this kind of thing is to prevent this bias by doing this exercise as part of a group. Ideally, that group should include your stakeholders, your users, or members of your product team, and ideally all of the above. The minimum is that you should do this with a friend or a colleague who can push you outside of your local minimum whenever you're stuck. Lastly, don't worry about things making sense. At this point, you're just generating an idea. You have a lot of time to invalidate them. So feel free to really think outside of the box.